Welcome back, everybody. This is our last week of Acts, and we are going to look into Acts 26, 27, and 28. And last week, we heard about Paul being taken to Caesarea by 470 soldiers to avoid being murdered. And this week, we're going to hear about him giving his testimony again before King Agrippa and Festus. And during this time, he really focuses in on the resurrection of Jesus, and he's playing into the fact that the Pharisees and Sadducees fight over whether or not there really is a resurrection.
Right.
And he says that because of this hope of the resurrection, that is why he's standing before the people today and giving his testimony.
Yeah, so hopefully this has been a good journey for you over the last month, as it has for us. It's been a lot of fun for us to jump into Acts together. And again, just a reminder as we're wrapping up the book, this book takes place over about 35 years. So when we started Acts chapter 1, just 4 or so weeks ago, right, that was 30 years earlier. And in just these three chapters that we're going to cover today, 26, 27, and 28, they take about 2.5 years of time to cover. And so again, that's really important when you read this stuff because it helps you to understand the amount of time it takes to travel from place to place and the amount of time it just takes for certain events to happen. And Luke is giving us the highlights of all of this. In 26, as Autumn was just saying, we see Paul is in front of King Agrippa. This is Herod Agrippa's great-grandson. So the Herod that tried, 60 years earlier, that tried to have Jesus murdered when he was just a baby. It's now his grandson that is presiding over this trial of Paul, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And what's also really crazy, especially for us, is when you find out that his name is Marcus Julius, right? Marcus Julius Agrippa. And his sister is Bernice. And Bernice's sister was a woman by the name of Drusilla, who was Felix's wife, the previous governor's wife. So if you picture this, right, so these two sisters, Drusilla and Bernice, are married to the governor of Rome and the king, so to speak, of Palestine, right? So there's a lot of power kind of contained, right, in this one little family. It's also why Felix...
a lot of soap opera, too, because there's some question of whether or not there is a relationship between Agrippa and Bernice, who are brother and sister, actually.
Right, yeah, so it's definitely weird, right? But it also helps to explain why some of the things happen with Paul and why does Paul get the good treatment that he gets, because when Felix steps down, Festus steps up, and Felix and Festus are connected because the sisters are connected, and who's connected to the king Agrippa. And so sometimes people read all this and they're like, okay, is it realistic that Paul would be treated so kindly as a prisoner? Well, it is when you understand the context and you understand that really just a couple of families controlled all this power. And Herod Agrippa, as we find out from Paul's speech in chapter 26, he was already just favorable to the Jewish people. He knew the Jewish law, he knew the Jewish teaching. We know from history that Agrippa actually would talk and teach with the rabbis, which was, again, unheard of, that he would actually bring Jewish rabbis into his court to educate him on the Jewish law. And so he was a very, very informed man, and this is why, like Autumn said...
This is why Paul said, I think you know, Agrippa, that what I'm saying is true.
That's right.
When he was told by Felix that you're out of your mind.
Yeah,
right?
that the message of Jesus was true. That's why Paul says this to Agrippa, and Agrippa kind of retorts back and says, "Okay, you're not going to do you really think you're going to make a Christian out of me so easily?"
Quickly, yeah.
Right. And there's a little bit of debate. Some people actually think that that Agrippa did believe what Paul was saying, but he just wasn't ready to admit it publicly. Right. And so you can see, if you've been with us for a while, you know that Autumn and I not only like to read the Bible, but our cats like to read the Bible with us as well.
Yes, they do.
So this is our cat, Sully.
This is how I read the Bible every morning.
This is right.
I have
so
to
he
fight
comes
for my Bible.
He joins us during our Bible reading time.
Can we just sit you down a little closer?
So Acts chapter 26 ends with all of these people again that we just met: Bernice and Drusilla and Herod Agrippa and Festus. They're all talking, and they all basically decide that Paul's innocent. right? And they say, it's very telling. They say this guy doesn't even, he shouldn't even be in prison, right? Let alone being condemned
Right.
or possibly being executed. He should just be able to go free. But they all recognize that because Paul's a Roman citizen, because all this was really public, and because Paul appealed to Caesar, they can't just turn him loose. They have to actually send him to Rome now, so that he can go have his day in front of Caesar.
Because Paul appealed to Caesar.
Right.
So,
right. And so that's where chapter 26 ends, and we move into chapter 27.
Before we jump into that, I just want to say, at the end of 26, verse 22, Paul actually says, to this day, I'm going to find it really quick. To this day, I've had God's help. So I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses have said have happened. So he's saying, I'm just telling you everything has been completed. Everything that you've been told in the Old Testament, that a Messiah would come, that he would come to save the people. He has come. And he's saying, I'm just testifying to that. But to this day, I've had God's help, which is interesting because he's been shipwrecked.
Right.
He's been stoned. He's been put in prison multiple times. And he's yet saying and testifying to God's goodness towards him, which I think is really important for us as we think of all the things that maybe we face, and most importantly, what's going on, obviously, with Christians in Afghanistan right now and what they face. I find Acts to be incredibly encouraging that Paul would have that perspective, that even in the midst of all those trials, that God was with him.
Yeah, and that's the point, right? Paul would never say that all these things were good. He just recalls very clearly that in the midst of all this tragedy, God was actually with him personally. He hadn't been abandoned, and he could see God's fingerprints.
Yeah, it's a vision for eternity,
right?
It's not a temporal vision
Yeah.
for current day prosperity, but for eternity.
Yeah, that's good. And so in chapter 27, when Paul he heads over to Rome, and again, it's also interesting because all these people are favorable towards Paul. They also allow Paul to do something unusual, which is to have his friends and his companions with him as he travels. And so this is, again, how Luke is in the story. Luke actually, we find out, is in 27. He's been with Paul this whole time, and he's taking notes and writing all this down because they allow Paul to have his friends with him. Now, this is not only a big deal, emotionally, but again, in Roman prisons, guards didn't feed the prisoners, right? Guards didn't take care of the prisoners. Guards didn't clothe the prisoners. They didn't give the prisoners anything. And so if you didn't have friends and if you didn't have people that were taking care of you, it was actually quite common for people to die in a Roman prison just because they would starve to death or just because they would get sick and there would be no one to give them any medicine. And so by allowing all these companions to be with Paul's being cared for. And then we also hear in a couple of these side comments where King Agrippa actually says to the guards, or the centurion will say to the guards, not only do I want you to allow Paul's friends to take care of him, I want you to be kind to him. I want you to treat him nicely. And so Paul definitely has the favor of the Roman leaders and the people who are holding him under arrest right now, which is kind of interesting. And so they get ready to go to Rome, and they board this ship. Now, all through the Gospels, if you read the Bible a lot, the apostles are on fishing boats a lot. They're on little boats going overseas. This is not one of those boats. This is actually a huge Roman cargo ship.
Right.
Carrying probably, we're actually going to find out in the next chapter, chapter 28, carrying just under 300 people plus their cargo. So if you think about how big a ship, even by today's standards, would need to be to carry 300 people plus cargo, right? This is a big ship. So they've got soldiers on the ship, there's professional sailors on the ship, and then there's all the people who are being transported, people who are merchants who are taking their items from one city to another city, as well as apparently a number of prisoners that were under guard from Rome. And so they all board this ship. By now it's about 60 AD, so this is now 30 years after the resurrection. And Paul actually tells the centurion, who's loading up the soldiers and kind of taking care of the prisoners, he tells the centurion, listen, it's late in the year, we shouldn't do this. We should just wait. It's almost winter. We should just wait and
they don't listen the first time.
Right, kind of hold off and not do this journey. And the reason I bring this up is because there's nothing in the text that makes us think that this was a message from God, right? Paul isn't saying, thus saith the Lord. He doesn't say anything about, a revelation or prophecy. He's just saying basically, listen, I don't think this is a good idea. He's grown up around water. He's grown up as someone who understands the change of seasons. He's an educated man. And he's just saying, this is probably not smart. The centurion doesn't listen to him. They decide to take off, and they get hit by a huge storm. Right, the first day the storm happens, the ship is just battered by the storm nonstop. By the second day of the storm, the soldiers themselves now they're starting to get worried, and they're afraid that perhaps they're not going to make it. And so now Paul is actually talking to the Romans again, and he says to them, "Okay, we aren't going to make it through this." But God has given me a vision. An angel has appeared to me and told me that nobody on the ship is going to perish. But you do need to listen to what it is that I'm going to say. So it's a very interesting moment because everybody realizes that if they would have listened to Paul the first time, they wouldn't be in this mess. But now Paul's speaking up again, and now he is saying, without a doubt, no, this is from God. Right. Not a single person will perish, but you have to listen to what I'm going to say. Right, and so this is how we end up in chapter 27. Paul gives them very specific instructions. 14 days go by. A group of sailors, the ship is battered. They have to throw cargo overboard. They have to throw the tools that they actually use to maintain the ship overboard. They had to throw ropes and tie ropes around the ship because the wood was going to break up. And so, this is 14 days of just nonstop beating against the wind and the waves.
And at one point, some soldiers are going to try to leave, and
right.
Paul says, if they leave, we'll all perish. So they have to stay on the boat. And so it's almost like God's preparing these people to listen to Paul, so maybe they would actually be saved too. So everything Paul's saying is coming to pass.
Right.
And little by little, he's gaining their trust.
Yeah, so again, imagine what Autumn's saying, right? So prisoners, regular people, soldiers, sailors. It's the professional sailors who one night they realize how bad this is, and they try to sneak off in the lifeboat, right? And so they're going to leave the soldiers and the merchants and the cargo. They're just going to leave it on the boat by themselves, and they're trying to just save their own skin. And Paul finds out about this and tells the centurion. So the centurion not only prevents this from happening, but then he gives orders to the soldiers to actually cut away the lifeboats so that nobody has the chance of leaving the ship, because he recognizes that Paul is obviously speaking because he knows something, right? He knows something. He knows something's going to happen, and so. After, it's also in chapter 27 that we learn very specifically, Luke tells us there's 276 people on board, and the ship does end up, it's now adrift, right? And they end up, they're kind of just letting the ship blow them into a certain area. They end up off the coast of Malta. We're going to find that out in the beginning of chapter 28. And something really interesting about this, so as you read through chapter 27, what they did, they dropped a bunch of anchors. They dropped 4 anchors from their ship. And those anchors were meant to try to slow the ship down so it wouldn't just completely break apart on the rocks, right? So in the 1960s, this is pretty amazing, off the coast of Malta, archaeologists discovered in the water 4 Roman anchors that date from the 1st century that corresponds exactly with what Luke tells us took place. Now, Luke writes this all down in about 64 AD. So almost 2,000 years later, we actually found archaeological evidence off the coast of Malta that substantiate, no, there was a Roman ship. It really was in this area that Luke says it was. They did exactly what they said they did. They dropped anchors and then cut them loose. And we just have more evidence that this what we're reading in Scripture is actual historical evidence, right? It's not somebody's made up story. So that's kind of pretty cool. And so the end of verse 27, the ship washes up on shore. The soldiers want now to kill all the prisoners, right? Because, and we've seen this a couple times if you've read the Bible, if a Roman soldier allows a prisoner under their charge to escape, they're going to be executed, right? And so the soldiers now want to just execute all the prisoners and to basically save themselves. The centurion says, no, we're not going to do that. The centurion's still listening to what Paul says and God's promise that everybody on the ship will make it alive and will get through this alive. And so the centurion stops them and they decide to go up on shore. And they're on shore. They don't know it's Malta yet, but they're on shore of this country off the coast of Sicily. And now they are shipwrecked, and now they have to try to figure out what to do next.
Yeah.
And that's chapter 28.
So I find 27 really interesting, like
Yeah.
you said, because the centurion says, we're not going to kill the prisoner, specifically Paul.
Right.
And I still wonder, is Julius, which is the centurion, does he become a believer? And does Agrippa, does Festus, does Felix, Bernice, who, all these different people, we don't get to hear what the end of their story is. But I'm very curious when we get to heaven, are they going to be there? And what is the rest of their story? And I think overall, if you get lost in the history or the details, what you want to do is like kind of pull back and think a little bit, what is going on here? What is happening? And what's happening is God is creating a way for people to believe. And so this next story, which is going to seem very, very strange in the beginning of Acts 28, is Paul being bitten by a snake, by a viper, which is a very venomous snake. And we're like, what in the world is happening? But basically, he builds a fire, and we know snakes like to hide in the wood and the brush, and the fire pushes the snake out, and it bites Paul. And so now these people believe wholeheartedly that Paul was cursed if he was bitten by the snake. But then since he lives, then they believe he's a god.
Yeah.
So they're very superstitious people. And so again, we're having Paul get the trust of people around him so that they can believe in the one true God.
Yeah.
And so over and over again, when you hear these stories, you want to say, well, why would God do that? Why would God, why would this happen? And then why would God allow this? And so then people come to him and they're healed. Obviously, it's God's power, not Paul's power, that heals the people. And Paul always gives credit to God for any healing. So we see this happening in Acts 28, is that these islanders, actually, some come to believe.
Yeah, it's really,
in Jesus.
it's really fascinating
Malta.
because, so Malta is a really small island. It's off the coast of Sicily. It's only 17 miles by 9 miles, right? So if you think about this, it's really small, right? Most of the cities that we live in are bigger than the entire island of Malta, but it's its own country. And there's no way these people, it was under control of the Roman Empire by this point. Right now, Malta is a free nation now in our world today, but under this time, they were, just like most of the world, they were controlled by the Romans. And there's no way that anybody would intentionally pick Malta to go to, because it was just so small, it's out of the way, it's not a place they're going to waste time.
Right.
But God brings Paul there, right?
And then he brings him to Publius, who is a chief official and islander, and his father is ill.
Right.
And so Paul heals his father. So you see this leader that becomes a believer.
Yeah.
And of course, that's going to also influence the whole
and
island
again,
of Malta.
you just think about the dynamic of what's taking place. These people see a shipwreck. They think God is on their side because he spared their life. Paul builds a fire, and a viper comes out of the wood and bites Paul. And so they say, oh, maybe God isn't on their side because God actually wanted this guy to die. So since he didn't die in a shipwreck, he's going to die by this poisonous snake. The poisonous snake doesn't kill him, doesn't even make him swell up. He gets sick in no way. So now they decide, okay, well, maybe this guy is a god, right? And so after a couple of days, the leader, brings Paul and his companions to his home because the leader's father is sick. Paul heals the leader, right? The leader's father. The rest of the people in the village who are sick also find out about Paul, and Paul heals all of them as well, right? So I mean, it's exactly what you were saying. It's this whole idea that something bad and tragic happens, God redeems it, and God does something through it. And of course, in all this, right, Paul is getting a chance to tell the story of why they're there, who they believe in, what their hope is in. And as we heard Paul say so many times, it's not him who's healing anybody, it's actually Jesus who's healing.
Well, and I think it's important to have this discussion because these are questions that are hard for us too. So just quickly, like when we look at these people that are very superstitious, right? We sometimes can be superstitious. We can kind of be lost in like, okay, how do I understand this healing idea and this concept? And, the ultimate answer is sometimes people just get sick.
Right.
Because we live on this broken planet.
Yeah.
And sometimes God does a miracle. And the thing that makes it a miracle is it's a miracle. That means it doesn't happen very often.
Right.
And it's supernatural. It's outside of natural. So we exist in the natural world. And these people thought everything that they saw was going to somehow be attached to something supernatural. So any everyday occurrence would be considered supernatural. So they attached things sometimes that were not attached. And I think we do that sometimes too in our world. We take something that's natural and we say, well, somebody is to be blamed for this. They sinned, therefore they are sick. And we don't maybe not recognize it as such as these people, as superstition, but it really is superstitious.
Yeah, it's also interesting, and this is something else that doesn't get a whole lot of airplay. If you look at all the healings that take place in the Bible, most of the time it's people who are followers of Jesus praying that God will heal someone who's not a follower of Jesus. Very rarely do you actually get the followers of Jesus asking for God to intercede supernaturally on their behalf, right? Now, that does happen for family members. It does happen in that way. So that I'm not saying anything's wrong with that, but I think what we don't think about so many times is the reason why Paul heals all these islanders who are sick, right? The reason why Jesus heals a bunch of people when he's traveling through Samaria who are sick is because he actually knows that by doing that, they're going to have the chance to hear the gospel and understand this God who loves them so much that they don't even know would actually do something miraculous on their behalf. That's a pretty big deal. And I think maybe that's encouragement even for us, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, for the people that we know in our lives that are sick, that don't know Jesus, maybe we should be a little bit more bold about asking God to heal them, right? Because talk about an amazing experience would be for someone who doesn't know that they're loved by God and for God to heal them miraculously, right? That's probably going to leave an impression, I would think.
And God cares about everyone that's sick and cares about all their healing, but most importantly, the healing that we need is a supernatural spiritual healing.
That's right.
And that's the healing that lasts forever.
So they spend 3 months on the island of Malta. The storm, the winter season passes. They start to load the ship up again. They get ready to go. And so again, everybody heads to Rome. Paul, all the traveling companions, they get to Rome. In verse 16, we discover that Paul's actually allowed to live on his own in a house with basically just one soldier guarding him. So again, Paul's getting very, very good and preferential treatment. And it's likely because everybody who's involved thinks that he's innocent, and they also know he's a Roman citizen, so they're going to treat him better anyway. And what's interesting is, so now Paul gets to Rome, and the Jewish people hear about what's happening. They hear about this trial that's going to take place. Paul actually talks to them and says, okay, maybe you've heard about me, and maybe you've heard about some of the controversy. And they actually respond to Paul and they say, no, we don't know anything about you. I haven't heard a thing about you, actually. But what we have heard a lot about is this sect called the Way that supposedly, worships a dead Jewish carpenter and says he's come back to life. So we've heard a lot about that. And if that's what you're talking about, we actually want to hear more about that from you, because they recognize Paul's educated. They recognize he's a rabbi, that he's Jewish, that he knows what he's talking about. And so a couple of days later, a huge number of Jewish people, leaders, Jewish educated people, rabbis, teachers, they come to hear Paul. Paul, once again, in chapter 28, gives this huge explanation of the gospel and who Jesus is. And Luke gives us this little interesting side note, and he tells us that some of the people believed him and some didn't, right? In other words, basically, it's exactly like what we experience today, right? It's not about how much you know. It's not about how well you speak. It's not about how convincing you are. That faith is a gift that comes from the Holy Spirit. I can't make anybody believe anything. I can only pray and ask for the Holy Spirit to give faith to the people who need to have faith. And just like in Paul's day, some of the people believed him and some didn't. And so some people walked away, but other people said, no, we want to hear more about Jesus, and we want to learn more about Jesus.
And the interesting thing is, when some people believed and some didn't, he goes into a prophecy by Isaiah, and normally we're looking at it going, let's not offend anybody, and we shouldn't. We shouldn't be offensive, but he's pretty offensive here. So he says to the people that would have known this prophecy, go and tell this people and say, this is from Isaiah too, you will ever be hearing but never understanding. You will ever seeing but never perceiving.
Right.
For this people's heart has become calloused. And so he's telling them, it's a warning. It's a very stern warning that you hear these words, but you're so callous, you can't
and
respond.
I'm going to say probably offensive isn't actually even the best word. It's not that he is offensive, right? But Paul always knows his audience, right? So he's being very direct and he's being very blunt.
Assertive.
Right? Because he's talking to people, to Jewish religious leaders and teachers who knew the Old Testament and who were supposedly waiting for the Messiah, right? And so for him to quote Isaiah and to say basically, okay, Isaiah said you missed it, you did miss it, I'm here to tell you again, you've missed it, right? That's basically what's going on, right? You will miss it, you did, and I'm repeating that fact.
Well, and we
so
can
he's
be
just being very,
compassionate
very
to
direct.
why they've become calloused in some ways, too, because they've waited for over 400 years where they haven't heard anything from prophets. They've waited for an incredibly long time, and they've gone through hardship. But here Paul is saying, don't miss it.
Yeah, because, and again, he's not really being offensive. He's just being direct. And he's saying, I know that you know all this stuff. So he's treating people.
Well, they would have been offended.
They would have been offended. I would agree with you on that. But he's not trying to be offensive, right?
For sure.
Sometimes, and the reason I make a big deal out of this is because sometimes, in some weird ways, there's some groups of people who think that being offensive is actually part of following Jesus, which is so not true, right? No, being a follower of Jesus, you should never be rude, right? You should never be seeking to hurt people's feelings or upset people. That's not the goal, right? So that's why I know but that's why I said what I said, because he's just being very clear and very direct. And so now after this, Paul is in this home for 2 years, right? He's under house arrest. His court case is kind of moving up the ladder of bureaucracy. But it's during these 2 years that while he's under house arrest that he gets to write a bunch of the Bible, the books of the New Testament Bible that we have. He writes Ephesians, he writes Colossians, he writes Philippians, Philemon. Those are known as the prison letters. He writes 2 Timothy, right? So there's a bunch of really important documents that he has the chance to write because he can't do anything for 2 years.
Yeah, we might be tempted to think that's wasted time, time that is spent there, and yet look at
how much do those letters contribute to our faith today, right? And what we know about Jesus and what it means to follow Jesus. Imagine not having Philippians, right? Imagine not having Ephesians or Timothy, 2 Timothy, right? So
he would have been thinking of all the people he could be reaching if he wasn't in prison, and in the meantime he's writing the whole New Testament.
And he knows what's about to happen. In fact, in 2 Timothy, in the end of 2 Timothy, the Apostle Paul actually says, even now, my life is getting ready to be poured out like a drink offering, right? So he knows that his time is coming to an end,
right?
And very soon it is going to come to an end. In fact, again, history tells us that it's the Emperor Nero. Is 64 AD, right after Nero burns the city of Rome. He orders the Apostle Paul to be executed, and
beheaded by sword.
Right, because he's a Roman citizen, he can't be crucified, and so a soldier, and we don't know if it was the soldier that was guarding him every day. It very likely could have been, which would be, imagine that, right? Is given orders to behead the Apostle Paul, and so they take him out someplace out of town, is where it was done, and he was executed. And this is 64 AD, 35 years after the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, so the very last verse is verse 30. It says, "For 2 whole years Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. Boldly and without hindrance he preached the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ." So that's what we want to do. We want to boldly preach the word of God and teach and lead and disciple, and that really is what Acts is all about. That's what makes me love Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. The word apostle means sent one, and we're sent ones. And so just living out Matthew 28, that we're going to go and make disciples.
Yeah. So we hope that you've enjoyed this study. I hope, we both hope that it's helped you in your ability to learn how to study the Bible yourself. As you've hopefully made notes and you've made lots of observations, you start to see what it means to take those observations and then to interpret them and say, okay, what does this mean and why is this important? And then once we do that, we figure out how to apply it. And that's just what Autumn is talking about today. That's what we want to do. We want to teach you how to apply this so that you can be a disciple of Jesus, so that you can continue to follow Jesus.
If you've liked this, like and subscribe and follow us on YouTube.
That's right. God bless.